I'm back with If Your Name Was Changed at Ellis Island. We left off yesterday reading about how people got to America from their home countries, and today we're going to read about what it was like when they landed at Ellis Island. They finally made it to New York. Where would you go when you landed at Ellis Island? When the barge pulled up at the dock at Ellis Island, immigrants walked under the entry arches into the ground floor baggage room where they left some of their luggage. Others held onto all of their bags. One baggage worker said he could recognize what country people had come from by the type of their luggage they carried and by the way they tied knots around their bundles. Then they also went up a staircase into the registry room known as the Great Hall. There, they would be examined again by doctors and then by immigration inspectors. As they reached the top of the stairs, the Great Hall spread out before them like a huge maze. Metal pipes divided the space into narrow aisles, and sections were enclosed in wire mesh. One young immigrant said you'd think you were in a zoo. Here's a close-up illustration of what that Great Hall looked like. After 1911, the iron pipes were removed and replaced by long rows of wooden benches. Hundreds, at times thousands of immigrants passed through the Great Hall. The noise, some said, was like the Tower of Babel. Sometimes 30 languages could be spoken at one time. Ellis Island was like a miniature city for immigrants. There were waiting rooms, dormitories for over 1,000 people, restaurants, a hospital, a baggage room, a post office, banks to change foreign money, a railroad ticket office, medical and legal examination rooms, baths, laundries, office areas for charities and church groups, and courtrooms. Ellis Island was the last hurdle you had to pass before you were to enter the country. Who examined you at Ellis Island? Doctors were the first to examine you and then began before you even knew it. When you walked up the stairs to the Great Hall, the doctors were watching you. They wanted to see if you limped or had any difficulty breathing. When you reached the top, they looked at your skin, throat, hands, and scalp. Children older than 2 had to walk by themselves. All immigrants were asked their names to see if they could hear and speak. Other doctors used a finger or a metal button hook to roll your eyelids back to see if you had a contagious eye disease called trachoma. One little girl was almost sent home because her eyes were all red. She had been sick on board and cried so much that her eyes were sore. After 3 days, she was allowed to stay. The walk up the stairs was called the 6-second medical. And then the doctors at the top usually took 2 to 3 minutes to examine you. All of these exams together usually took less than 5 minutes. What happened if the doctor found something wrong with you? If the doctors thought something was wrong with you, they would put a chalk mark on your clothes at your shoulder or your back. An X stood for possible mental problem. B stood for back. E stood for eyes. P stood for physical or lungs. SC for scalp. L for lameness. CT for trachoma. Every child's head and nails were examined for lice and a contagious disease called Favis. If you had a chalk mark, you'd have to go for further examinations. One young girl, nervous about leaving her home and coming to another country, had developed warts on her hands. The doctor chalked an X on her coat. She and her family were very afraid that she might be sent back home. She was wearing a new coat with a very pretty lining. A kind man told her to turn her coat inside out so that the chalk mark wouldn't show. She never found out if he was an inspector or another immigrant, but she did what he suggested and was never examined again. If you were detained, you were taken to a special area for further exams. If your sickness was curable, you were kept in the hospital until you were better. Many babies and young people arrived with measles, scarlet fever, or diphtheria. Favis, a scalp and nail disease, was also common. Most children stayed in the hospital 1 to 2 weeks before they were released. To keep the diseases from spreading, there was a printed warning for the nurses on the wall of the children's ward. Do not hug or kiss the patients. If your disease was contagious and incurable, you were put in a special hospital area until a steamship took you back to the city you came from. What kind of mental tests were given? If the doctors wanted to give you an intelligence test, they'd mark you with an X. They wanted to be certain you were not feeble-minded. If you were a child, they wanted to be certain when you grew up, you'd be able to work. When you were marked with an X, you were taken to a special room where they'd ask you a few questions about yourself. Ellis Island had to have interpreters for at least 30 languages. The examiners would give some simple arithmetic or math problems and ask you to count backwards from 20 to 1 and have you complete a puzzle. In one test, you would put wooden pieces in different shapes into a pegboard. You might be asked to read a paragraph. If you didn't know how to read, you'd be shown pictures of 8 faces and be asked to pick the 4 happy ones and the 4 unhappy ones. Then you'd be asked to match up similar drawings from 2 groups of pictures. One young girl had an X chalked on her shoulder. When she passed all the tests easily, the doctor said, "Oh, we must have made a mistake," and removed the X. Sometimes you were asked to explain the meaning of a picture. In one drawing, a group of American children was watching a boy dig a hole in a garden. A dead rabbit was lying on the ground near the boy. Many immigrants said that the children had killed the rabbit for dinner, which was common in Europe. The answer the doctors expected was that they were burying a pet who had died. Fiorello LaGuardia was the mayor of New York City for many years. Before he'd become mayor, he worked as an interpreter on Ellis Island. He believed that more than half the people who were sent home because of supposed mental problems should have been allowed to stay. He said that Ellis Island doctors often didn't understand people from other countries might do things and think about things differently than Americans. Instead, the doctors would decide that the immigrants had mental problems and send them home. LaGuardia thought that was wrong. What did the legal inspectors do? After you were cleared by the doctors, you would wait in long aisles until your ship number, called a manifest number, was called. Then you would move up the aisles slowly with all the people from your ship. Everyone had an identification card with the manifest number on it. Many people wore their ID cards around their necks or pinned to their clothing. The legal inspectors sat at high desks at the end of the Great Hall. Next to them were interpreters. Each inspector had the ship's list, the manifest, that the officers had filled out with the information about every passenger. The inspectors had to decide whether you were, in the words of the law, clearly and beyond a doubt entitled to land. They asked each immigrant between 20 and 30 questions. They wanted to know your name, place of birth, where you were coming from, where you were going, if you had any relatives in America, who paid for the passage, and other such questions. The inspectors had so many people to examine that they usually spent only 2 to 3 minutes on each person. Although most immigrants passed the legal examination, it was often very confusing and frightening for people. Questions were shot at them like bullets from a gun. The interpreters weren't always accurate. Most of all, every immigrant knew what a wrong answer or an answer an inspector didn't like could mean. You could be deported and sent back to your old country. So I'm going to stop there for today. Next time I'll continue with if your name was changed at Ellis Island, a little bit more about what people went through when they got to Ellis Island.